Hey guys, moving on to the second match, and we have a problem because Gainsay is playing blue-white control, and sweet god, is this a complicated deck. So, I cannot really give you my opinion of the archetype, other than that I tried to play the archetype and my deck was wrong and I had no idea how to make the deck right, and I was playing this format for 3 days and it ended pretty poorly. Looking at this deck though, the biggest thing for me is look at this 2 slot and notice that there's something missing. There are no Squadron Hawks in this deck, and I love that so much. Thank you, Gainsay, because Squadron Hawk, it's not very good. It's a 1/1 flyer for 2 mana. When there were like swords that you wanted to play because of Stoneforge Mystic, then Squadron Hawk's a lot better. But this deck actually has 0 creatures in it. Has timely reinforcements that can make creatures. Has Gideon Jura, can become a creature. Elspeth can make creatures. But having no creatures, it gets to run the full 4 copies of Day of Judgment, and it really is a full-on control deck with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 planeswalkers. So, it's miles different from what I was playing, basically. The mana base isn't terribly interesting, just 4 obs of the good blue-white dual lands and 4 copies of Tectonic Edge. The other really cool thing in this deck is 2 main deck Gitaxian Probe. I love that. The information gained from seeing your opponent's hand is significantly valuable, and a problem in deciding whether to run Gitaxian Probe or not is the evaluation of how valuable it is. Gitaxian Probe does have drawbacks. One is that it costs a blue mana or 2 life. Another is that it gives you less perfect information about the cards in your own hand. For example, if you have an opening hand with no land but 2 Gitaxian Probe, it's very difficult to evaluate whether to keep or not. And even if you can evaluate whether it's a keep or not, you're evaluating based on percentages of whether there are lands on top of your deck or not. Whereas if the Gitaxian Probes were not in your deck, you might just have 1 land and 1 other spell, and then it's much plainer to you whether you can keep or not. That's the problem with all sort of cheap cantrip spells, is that they give you less of an idea when looking at opening mulliganing decisions. Although some of them, like Preordain, also smooth out your deck. So if you have Preordain and 1 land in your hand, you can actually keep more happily than if the card was not a Preordain. Another thing I like is no Ponder and no fetch lands. I have never really been a fan of Ponder, and I just don't think it's so great. And this deck doesn't really need to deal damage to itself, I don't think, especially with Gitaxian Probe already and Mental Misstep and Dismembers. So losing the Ponders and the fetch lands, which sort of go with the Ponders because you one-shot the effects, replacing them with Gitaxian Probes, leaving in the Preordains, I think that's really cool. 3 copies of Into the Royal. As far as the counter package, we have 5, 1 Mental Misstep, makes 6, but not a whole lot of counter spells, and the 4 mana leaks are conditional counter spells too, also as Mental Misstep. Just the 1 cancel is a absolute say no. Oh, sorry, Stoic Rebel's in here too, so one of those. Yeah, 3 Into the Royal, 4 Day of Judgment, like I said, 1 Leyline of Sanctity. This is pretty cool. There are cards which are valuable as one-offs just because the first time you draw it, creates a unique effect which is valuable. Torpor Orb, which is a 1-of in the board, is similar. Whereas the cards become much less valuable as you draw a second. The second Leyline of Sanctity does nothing. The same for Torpor Orb. And so cards like this make a lot of sense to include in your deck as 1-ofs. And you just get the value out of them the first time you draw them, and you don't have to worry about drawing a second and losing value. In a deck like Blue-White Control, where games will go very long, this is especially relevant. I've played against control decks which play multiple copies of these cards, and then when the games go long, they draw the multiple copies. And because they don't actually have a great card drawing engine, these control decks, like Jace Beleren is the best you've got, they actually end up losing longer games due to card disadvantage a decent amount of the time because they're drawing blank copies of cards like this. I was talking in the last video about including a 1-of Thrun in your mono green list. I think that's a similar concept, although mono green decks, it won't be quite as significant because games don't go as long. Note, however, that Thrun is great against control decks, and against control decks, games do go long, so there is that other side of the coin, that actually the 1-of Thrun in the matchups where it's relevant, it's very valuable. There's more chance to draw it. So, removal, 2 Dismember, no Oblivion Ring at all in this Blue-White Control deck. That effect gets replaced by Karn Liberated, who is a 2-of. That's pretty cool. Pretty cool. Karn's a big guy. And we also have 2 copies of Gideon, 1 of Elspeth. This is the high end of the deck. So, the plan against an aggro deck is going to be to stabilize, clear the board with Day of Judgment, drop massive planeswalkers, and just overwhelm. And the deck's so complicated that I can't really comment on what its plan is in other matchups, but Gainsay, I feel, is a very good player who's played with the deck a lot and has developed very good plans. Like you can see versus Twin, he has 2 Dismember, 3 Enter the Royal, a decent amount of counterspell interaction, and in the board, 1 Torpor Orb, 1 Dismember, Flash Freeze counters red spells. I don't know if those come in. Okay. He does have 2 more Leyline of Sanctity in the sideboard. I don't know. I don't quite understand what deck you want a 2nd and 3rd Leyline of Sanctity against. He also has Condemn, just to deal with creatures more. I assume that can even come in against control decks. It just deals with any creature that attacks you. Celestial Purge deals with black and red permanents, so that's another option against Twin. I sort of get the impression that he's playing a ton of cards which sort of add up to be good against Twin, but none of them are necessarily only purposed towards Twin. So it seems like his plan versus Twin is you just need a big enough density of cards that interact with their combo. Mental Misstep, I assume, comes in as well. But the cards don't need to be Torpor Orb, which is bad in other matchups. They can be good in other matchups, but still interact. That makes a lot of sense to me. 1 copy of Volition Reigns that can grab Planeswalkers, which is sort of cool. 2 more copies of Timely Reinforcements. So, man, that deck is a mouthful. 9 minutes? Huh. There were, I think, 4 Blue-White Control decks in this top 8, so you'll get to see some other lists, and I'll be comparing them to this one, and yeah, my understanding of the archetype is going to improve a lot as I watch this top 8. Okay, I'm going to pause this and fix that. Okay, we're back. Didn't quite destroy my computer. Millennium 9999. And just say it all the way out every single time. We have another green deck. We saw Jaehoon playing one of these earlier. And the decks do have some quite noticeable differences. One first difference is there's 1 more land total, but 4 copies of fetch lands. So Millennium, I guess, has decided he's more comfortable paying a little life for his mountain base to thin his deck of forests. I wonder how the aggro-red matchup looks, because like it just seems sort of sensible to me to play 8 fetch lands. Against control, the increased threat density from getting land out of your deck is going to be very valuable. Maybe control isn't a big deal, but other aggro decks are. Millennium 9999 is only playing 4 1-drops, which seems way too slow to me. But his deck seems very tooled to beat control, so maybe that's a purposeful decision by him. He's just not so worried about getting off to fast starts against something like Splinter Twin, and is more interested in just fat stuff. He does have 3 copies of Sylvan Ranger, rather than the Eldrazi creature. What is it? I can tell you what it is. It's a 2/2 for 2, which puts an Eldrazi spawn, which can sack for 1 mana into play. Rather than that, Sylvan Ranger is a 1/1, which searches for a basic land, so it's better at making Dungrove Elder bigger, but it doesn't actually accelerate you either. Overall, this list is quite a lot slower than Jaehoon's. We see the same 4 copies of Leatherback Baloth, 4 copies of Dungrove Elder. Those seem like staples of the deck. 3 copies of Dismember and 3 of Beast Within, so that's 1 more card than Jaehoon had main deck that interacts. And 2 copies of Sword of War and Peace main deck, so maybe that's a nod to the aggro-red matchup. Although, coupling Sword of War and Peace with the inability to accelerate effectively seems to me like a risky proposition. This is a deck where I feel like Jiraga Treespeaker would be pretty good, because a lot of these cards really do cost a lot of mana. Green Sun Zenith even up here. Anyway, moving on to the 4 slot, we see 3 copies of main deck Thrun. I think this is excessive, surely. Against control decks, the game goes long, and Thrun is extremely hard to get off the table, although they can often just sort of chump block Thrun indefinitely, or sort of ignore him. I feel like if you're going to have Thrun as a plan at all against control, you probably want to do it with the intention of not drawing multiples. Like, probably when you go for a Thrun plan, you're going to win a War of Attrition a decent amount more than usual. And when you're looking at winning a War of Attrition a decent amount more than usual, it's going to pay to not have 2 dead cards in your deck, which the 2nd and 3rd copies of Thrun are going to be. For the same reasons I was talking about with the blue-white control deck, which could have multiple Torpor Orbs, which become dead when you're trading 1 for 1 in the mid and late game. Just 2 copies of Obstinate Baloth, 3 copies rather than 4 of Overwhelming Stampede. That's another way in which this deck is just a little bit slower than Jaehoon's, it seems. Garruk Primal Hunter over Garruk Wildspeaker main. He costs more, and there's less ability to accelerate into him. But I've never played the deck, I can't really analyze that. And then Green Sun Zenith, I think this deck should play 4. It's the best. It's the best. It's so good. I would like this deck to have like 2 more Green Sun Zenith, 2 less Thrun, 1 Jiraga Treespeaker at least to fetch with the Zenith, and be willing to play an attrition battle against control. Because Green Sun Zenith is so powerful, it shuffles itself into your deck. When you cast it, you don't really lose threat density. You sort of do because it takes a creature out of your deck. You sort of don't because it's shuffling itself back in and you put the creature on the board. I'm not enunciating myself very well and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you do lose threat density because you're taking out a creature. Anyway, one thing I'm sure that you do is you get to choose a creature. And so if you have a toolbox of Obstinate Baloth, maybe you go up to 8 fetch lands and play Grazing Gladeheart, because that's an efficient way to make a lot of life against the red decks. Go up to 3 or 4 Green Sun Zenith, and just, yeah, be willing to sort of play longer games with a more utility-based deck rather than just a single-minded beat your face in deck. I really feel like that is almost certainly the most powerful direction to take this deck. If you're not going for the Zenith plan, I feel like that has to be because it's too slow, and you want to be taking it in tons of minor accelerant creatures just into 3 and 4 drops as much as possible. And then Overwhelming Stampede is a 4-of. Those are sort of just looking at the archetype, my thoughts on where you probably want to go. Let's look at his sideboard. Full 4 copies of Nature's Claim and adding a Dismember. So I guess he's aware that Twin is a terrible matchup. He also has 4 copies of Torpor Orb. I don't know if that's enough to swing in his favor or what, but it is a lot. 2 copies of Obstinate Baloth gets him up to 4 post-board, and 3 copies of Creeping Corrosion, which again I assume are against Tempered Steel. I don't know. I don't feel like there's really a deck in Standard that plays a lot of artifacts. Like Tempered Steel, okay, I keep saying that, but I don't really feel like that's a deck in Standard. It certainly didn't show up in the top 8, and not a whole lot of people were playing it elsewhere in the tournament. I was watching the tournament a bit as it was going on. And unfortunately, I don't know that there's any metagame breakdown online for all the decks. I've only been able to find the top 16 deck lists, and I've only actually looked at the top 8. One more Garrett Primal Hunter on the board as well. Okay, so those are the decks. Man, that was a mouthful. Somehow I spent twice as long almost on those 2 than the first match. Maybe it's because I'm getting better and have deeper insight or something. Who knows? I'm gonna